A boy stood on a floor of cracked black marble while the sky above him tore itself open. 5,000 years of buried grief pressed down on his shoulders. At the far end of a ruined throne room, a shape wrapped in dark flame pulled itself out of a dead man's silhouette. It looked at him and remembered him. Around the boy, 4 allies held their weapons ready. Not one of them knew who he really was. Not one of them knew that the person leading them into that room had already lived through this war once, and had lost every friend he loved doing it. That was where the story would end. Before that, on a quiet training ground behind a noble estate, a girl in polished armor swung her family's most treasured sword at a 15-year-old boy's face. She was one of the country's celebrated prodigies. Her house had produced knights for 11 generations. He should have died on the 3rd strike. Instead, he stepped inside her guard, took her wrist with 2 fingers, and lifted the sword away as if he were taking a spoon from a child. He tossed her a thin silver bracelet as she stumbled back into the dust, and asked her to try wearing it. She caught it with an insulted laugh. Her whole arm hit the ground the next second, and stayed there. The bracelet weighed more than she did. She had never noticed him wearing 2 of them for the entire duel. That would come later too. The story truly began in a nursery lit by afternoon sun. A young mother sat by the window with a small book balanced on her knees, reading it aloud to her infant son. She turned the pages slowly. She described the heroes of the ancient war in a soft, patient voice. There was the archer who split the moon. There was the sorcerer who tamed lightning. There was the poet who called the stars down out of the sky. She read every one of their names aloud, warm and careful, certain her boy could not yet understand a single word. Her boy understood every word. His own name was not in the book. His old name, Kyle, the name he had carried on the day the sun went black and the Demon King Arabus finally fell, had been scraped clean out of the world. The infant in the crib pushed one tiny fist against the blanket and did not cry. He listened to the mother he had not met in 5,000 years. Somewhere behind that soft baby face, he began to think. Someone had erased him. Between his death and this cradle, the world had decided he was inconvenient. His comrades were still remembered. Their statues, apparently, still stood in city squares. Their poems still lulled children to sleep. His name alone was missing, and no one in this bright, peaceful room understood why. He would find out. He promised himself so on his 2nd day of a second life. His new name, in the ledger of this house, was Leo Plav. His father was a proud, mild noble who managed the family lands with a bookkeeper's patient care. His mother was Reina, the woman with the picture book. He learned things about her slowly, the way a hidden guest learns a house. She had a bad ankle that ached when the weather turned. She kept an old sword under a cloth in her wardrobe and cleaned it herself on the 1st day of each season. She never let the servants touch it. It took him nearly a year to piece the truth together from stray words between a maid and a groundskeeper. His mother had once been one of the great Aura swordswomen of the North. She had walked into a dungeon at 19 with a young hero she had sworn to guard, and she had burned every last drop of her aura to bring him out breathing. Her body had never recovered. She could still walk. She could not still fight. Her supreme aura, the light that had earned her a nickname across 3 provinces, was gone. She had never complained about it. Not to her husband, not to her friends, not to the boy she now rocked to sleep. She had made a choice, saved a life, and gone home. That was that. Leo listened to her humming in the mornings and quietly filed away another reason to become strong. He grew fast. The house indulged him because he was clever and beautiful and made his mother smile. He read every history book he could reach. Every one of them told the story of the war against Arabus in the same way, and every one of them left him out. His old comrades were there. Some had been elevated, painted brighter than they had been in life. Others had been shrunk down to minor sidekicks. His face and his name had simply been snipped, the way a censor slices a bad frame out of a reel. In one book he found a footnote. It called the leader of the ancient heroes a scammer, a man, it said, who had taken credit for other people's victories. Leo read the line 3 times, put the book back on the shelf, and did not touch it again. His body posed the second problem. In this world, mana ran through every person like blood. From that mana, 3 great paths branched. A person could burn it inside themselves and forge aura, the inner fire of knights. A person could shape it outside themselves into spells, the craft of sorcerers. A person could bind it to living spirits and call summons, the way of tamers. Almost everyone chose one. A rare few managed two. Nobody at all held all three, because the instant you specialized, the other paths shrank and closed. Leo's old body had gone through the war holding all three at once. He had earned that the slow, painful way. Starting over as a one-trick knight was not on his list, so he refused the aura training his father offered. He refused it gently at first, then firmly, then with a stubbornness that made even Reina raise her eyebrows. While other boys his age lit their first sparks, he sat reading on his mother's lap. A rumor spread through the household staff that the young master might simply be a late bloomer. His cousins snickered at family dinners. He let all of it slide off him. Inside, he kept his mana loose and unclaimed, patient, waiting for the day his growing body could hold everything at once again. By the day his cousin Celia came to visit the estate, that patience was still holding. Celia Zeringer was the pride of the Zeringer branch of the family, and she carried it into every room she entered. She was 14. She had already been accepted into the Lumina Academy's day division on early trial. Her hair sat in a neat braid down her back, and she looked at Leo the way a champion racehorse might look at a donkey. Her mother, Reina's sister, had brought her over to arrange a formal courtesy visit before her entrance ceremony. Celia had accepted the courtesy the way one accepts a chore. They met in the West Garden. She was polite for exactly 2 minutes. Then she looked him over, from his soft training clothes to his empty belt, and asked, with the sweetness only rude girls can manage, whether he intended to walk into Lumina behind her as her attendant. Leo told her, mildly, that he intended to walk into Lumina at the same time she did, as a fellow student, and to beat her in whichever class they shared first. Her smile did not move, only her eyes changed. She proposed a spar. She proposed stakes. If she won, he would apologize before both branches of the family and admit he had been foolish. If, by some absurd miracle of the gods, he won, she would spend 1 week inside his household in a maid's uniform, doing whatever chores he chose, and she would call him young master while doing them. Her confidence was so complete that she did not even lower her voice while offering the terms. Leo agreed on the spot. He asked for 1 hour to change. Then he went inside, took 2 thin bracelets from the bottom of a drawer, and clasped one on each wrist beneath his sleeves. They were an old training tool of his mother's. Each of them, when activated, weighed as much as a grown man wearing plate armor. He activated both, rolled his sleeves back down, and walked out to the training ring as if he were only going to talk. Half the household followed. A groom carried out chairs. Reina came at her own pace and took a seat at the edge of the ring with a cup of tea. She did not look worried. She looked, faintly, amused, in the way a mother is amused by any spectacle involving a very confident niece. Celia had chosen her family's most treasured practice sword. The blade was blunted at the tip. The aura she poured into it was not blunt at all. She lit the edge with a pale gold shimmer, saluted with theatrical grace, and told him not to blame her afterward. Out of respect for his health, she said, she would use only 2 of the Zeringer secret techniques. Leo saluted with an empty hand. She came at him. Her first slash was the classic opening of the Zeringer falling petal, a beautiful arc that ended, in a proper duel, with the opponent's guard broken open. Leo did not raise a guard. He shifted 1 step to the side, so precisely that the blade passed a hand's width from his ribs, and let the momentum of the strike pull her forward. She recovered instantly, as trained. Her second cut came at his knee, an angle meant to force a stumble. He tilted his weight, tapped her wrist with 2 fingers, and altered the sword's line by a finger's breadth. It missed him entirely and bit air. She frowned. She reset. Her second promised technique, the petal storm, was a rapid chain of 6 strikes woven so tightly that no cadet her age had ever passed through it without a bruise. Somewhere in the crowd a small sound of anticipation escaped. Leo answered by staying still for the first strike, drifting 2 inches for the second, ducking under the third with a lazy motion of his head, and, on the fourth, catching her sleeve and tugging her just enough to unbalance the 5th and 6th into empty air. Her sword slipped from her fingers on the 7th nothing. It landed in the dust beside her boot. The crowd went silent. Reina blew softly on her tea. Celia stared at her own empty hand. She had never lost a sword in her life. Her face turned a shade of red usually reserved for imperial banners. She swept the blade back up, stepped away, and drew a breath through her nose so sharp it was almost a growl. She lit her aura fully, gold flame licking her skin, and told him she would take back the wager offer if he yielded now. Leo did not yield. He asked her, politely, to please stop holding back. That did it. She came in with everything. Her final family technique was the crescent ninefold, and she poured it into a single furious strike. Leo let her commit. He stepped inside her range at the last instant, so close that her sword arm passed harmlessly over his shoulder, and pressed a flat palm gently against her sternum. He did not push hard. He only redirected her own momentum back through her balance. She went off her feet, sailed 3 full paces, and landed on her back in the dust, with the wind knocked out of her. For a long moment she just looked up at the sky. Leo walked over, offered her a hand, and pulled her upright. Before she could speak, he unclasped one of the bracelets from his own wrist and dropped it into her palm. "Try wearing it," he said, gently, "just to feel how it sat." She glared at him, wounded pride flaring. She slid it onto her arm with a jerk. Her wrist dropped to her side as if a stone had been chained to it. Her elbow followed, then her shoulder, then the whole side of her body sagged. She braced her feet, tried to lift the arm, and the arm did not move. She looked at him, mouth opening, and the look was no longer proud. It was staggered. He told her, kindly, that he had been wearing 2 of them the entire fight. At the edge of the ring, Reina set her cup down. She did not laugh. She only smiled the small, deep smile of a woman who had raised her son right. The wager stood. Celia moved into the Plav estate the very next day, because Zaringers did not welch on a bet even when they wanted to. Her mother had insisted, once she heard the terms, that a promise was a promise, and that a week of humility would do her daughter more good than another year of tutors. The head housekeeper handed her a plain maid's uniform, a cotton apron, and a schedule of duties. Celia wore the uniform with the same posture she had worn her armor. She did not sulk. She was too proud to sulk. Sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, she gripped a duster in her fist, as if she were trying to strangle it. Leo did not enjoy her humbling. He watched from a distance with the patience of someone who had lived a long time. He gave her light tasks. He asked her about her sword training between duties. He treated her, in short, like a cousin. She had no idea what to do with that, and it visibly bothered her more than any hard chore would have. On the 3rd afternoon, another young noble came to call at the estate. His name was Gullivan, and he was every inch the sort of boy who had been told, at least once a day since birth, that he was important. He had come, he announced, to inspect the Plav household's newly declared Lumina candidate, and, in passing, to pay respects to the visiting Miss Celia. He said the second half with a smirk. Everyone in earshot understood at once that respect was not what he was there to pay. Gullivan tried to plant himself between Celia and the entrance hall. He tried to compliment her uniform in a tone loud enough to sting. Finally, he tried to intimidate the young master of the house with a barb about noble children who thought too highly of themselves. Leo walked past him without slowing. He did not glance at Gullivan once. He greeted Celia by name, asked whether she had eaten, and led her into the dining room. Gullivan was left alone by the front door, mid-sentence, blinking at the empty space where his target used to be. A footman coughed politely and asked whether the young lord would like to be shown out. Gullivan turned the color of a bad plum and left before anyone else could witness it. Celia glanced sideways at Leo as they sat down for tea. She did not thank him. Her ears, however, were pink, and it was not from the walk. The week ended on a quiet morning. She bowed, once, correctly, in the entrance hall in front of her aunt and both branches of the family. She apologized for underestimating a cousin. She left with her family, her uniform folded neatly in her arms, and this time she did not look at Leo the way one looks at a donkey. She looked at him the way one looks at a locked door one intends to open, which was, Leo thought, an improvement. The Lumina entrance exam was still 6 months away. He used the time, 15 on paper. He ran the estate's back trail every dawn until his lungs burned. Afternoons went to sword forms without aura, repeated so many times that the shapes lived in his muscles by pure habit. Evenings went to the estate library, where he read everything the old shelves held about the age of calamity and silently corrected the margins in his head. Twice during those 6 months, he asked Reina to spar with him. The first time she laughed and told him to come back when he was taller. The second time, when he asked her seriously, she studied him for a long moment. Then she rose from her seat and led him out to the yard. She had lost her supreme aura in that dungeon at 19. She had not lost her sword. What she still carried, worn to a thin, hard edge, was decades of instinct. When she stepped onto the training ground with her old wrapped blade, the yard felt smaller. The birds went quiet. Leo bowed. She saluted back with the salute of a proper knight to another proper knight. At half strength, she still made him work harder than Celia had. She read his footwork before he shifted his weight. Twice her pommel caught his wrist, and the second time made him drop the practice sword outright. She did not gloat. She only smiled the same small smile and asked, when they were done, whether he still intended to sit the Lumina entrance exam a year early. He said he did. She turned the wooden sword over in her hand. Then she gave him her permission with a single nod and told him, in her ordinary quiet way, that if the Zerringers gave him grief in the halls, he was to remember that he was a Plav on his father's side and a Corbin on hers, and he was to answer them the way she had taught him. She kissed the top of his head and went inside to start dinner. Leo stood in the empty yard, the wooden sword hanging from his hand, and thought about a woman who had spent everything to save someone else and never asked for a coin back. He thought about the small footnote in the old book that called an ancient hero a fraud. He thought about a fragment of dark fire that was, 5,000 years later, still out there somewhere, still whispering into weak minds, still sanding his own name off history's walls one soft stroke at a time. His fingers tightened on the practice sword. If the world had forgotten the man who bled for it, then he would simply have to remind the world. Not with speeches, not with medals, with work. With every enemy the Demon King still had scattered through this age, hunted down one by one. Far to the south, in a small stone room lit by a candle whose flame gave no honest light, a hooded handler bent over a book bound in dead skin and asked, softly, into the dark, whether the old fires had felt anything shift. The book was still for a long moment. Then a single line of script scrawled itself across the empty page, in a handwriting the handler was not writing. Something in it had. The handler smiled, and closed the book, and reached for a bell that would summon a very particular kind of cadet. 6 months later, the road into the capital was choked with carriages, and every one of them carried a young hopeful trying not to look nervous. Leo walked. He preferred it. His mother's blade rested across his back in a plain leather wrap, and his father's crest was on nobody's tongue. He looked, from a distance, like a country boy who had wandered into the wrong parade. The Lumina Academy sat on a low hill above the city, ringed by a wall of pale stone. Behind that wall, 3 towers rose out of the morning haze. The tallest of them was the color of a knife. Applicants gathered in the vast courtyard at its base, sorted by number, and told to stand still. A few were already crying. Others were bragging so loudly it was easier to guess their rank than to ask. Leo threaded through them and took his place near the back, where nobody looked twice. A voice cut across the courtyard. The proctor stepped onto a stone dais and studied the crowd the way a butcher studies a shipment. He was not tall. His robe was the deep blue of the Sorcerers' Guild and had no ornaments on it at all, which, in that crowd, was itself a kind of statement. He introduced himself as Professor Albi Zeron, and half the applicants went silent as though a door had shut. Leo had never heard the name in his old life. In this one, it had followed him through every book he read. Sorcerer of the Magic Eye. Decimator of Tartaros. A man who had walked into 3 demonic outbreaks in 3 different provinces and walked out of all 3 of them alone. He was the highest-ranked examiner Lumina still sent into the field. For half a heartbeat, when Leo looked at the proctor's face, his gaze snagged on the man's left eye. Something under the iris moved that should not have moved. It was a slow, faint pulse of mana, coiled so densely that it felt less like a person's aura and more like a small, sealed lake. Leo looked away before the professor could notice him looking. He had seen an eye like that only once before, in a person who was not a person. He filed the memory away and returned his attention to the dais. Professor Albi explained the exam in 9 sentences. Applicants would be transported into a hero world drawn from an ancient record. The setting was a stretch of forest known as the Wild Forest. Their objective was simple: survive. Along the way, they would be assessed on combat, judgment, and their behavior toward other candidates. He did not use the word teamwork. He said behavior. There was a difference, and everyone who wanted to pass was expected to notice it. He raised his left hand. The courtyard vanished. Leo landed in leaf litter. The light came through a green canopy in cold, scattered patches, and the air smelled of wet moss and something faintly metallic underneath it. Birds screamed from a branch above him, and did not sound like real birds. Around him, other applicants were appearing in flashes of pale light, some upright, some tumbling. A boy landed badly on his ankle and cursed. A girl landed in a bush and came out of it snarling. The forest was already alive. Something large moved between the trees 100 paces away and did not step on a single dry leaf. Whatever it was hunting. Leo went still for exactly 3 breaths and listened. His hands were empty. He had refused to draw his blade until he understood the terrain. Around him, other candidates were breaking already into loud groups, either forming quick packs or eyeing each other for weaknesses. A cluster of noble sons had gathered under a fat oak and were auctioning off temporary alliances by house name. A shorter boy near the tree line, one of the exam's few beastmen candidates, sniffed the wind, chose a direction, and set off at a jog without waiting to be invited into anything. Leo watched him go. That one, he thought, was worth remembering. Then a spark of pale blue light popped in the corner of his vision, and a girl stepped out of a tree's shadow with a rune already half formed above her palm. She was small, she was very calm. The rune above her hand was a battle formula, and she was not aiming it at a monster. She was aiming it at him. She introduced herself with a name he already knew, Chelsea Llewellyn. The Llewellyns had been a middle-ranked mage clan 5,000 years ago. In this new age, according to the histories he had memorized, they had climbed to the top of the sorcerer's ladder and stayed there. She had every reason to feel confident, standing there with a spell ready and a stranger unarmed in front of her. She told him, in a level voice, that the exam graded highest on the number of monsters slain, that solo hunters scored better than crowds, and that she would not be sharing kills. She proposed, therefore, a very simple arrangement. He was to walk in the opposite direction from her, right now, and stay out of her hunting range for the rest of the day. Leo looked at her spell, then at her eyes, then at the way her wrist trembled, so slightly that a lesser observer would have missed it entirely. She was not confident. She was frightened. She had come out here alone, refused every alliance, and now she was learning that the forest was worse than the brochures had promised. Her spell was a threat, because a threat was cheaper than a fight. He did something she was not ready for. He walked toward her. Her rune brightened. She warned him, sharply, to stop. He did not stop. He did not raise his hands either. He simply kept walking, and when he was a pace from her open palm, he passed his own hand, slow and empty, across the front of her rune. The formula shivered. His fingertip touched a single knot in the pattern, and the whole thing came apart into blue sparks that drifted upward and died. She stared at her empty palm, then at him. Her mouth opened and did not immediately produce sound. Leo told her, gently, that a forest this loud with things that were not birds was not a place to hunt alone. He told her that a Llewellyn who died in an entrance exam would embarrass 3 generations of her elders, and that he had no interest in embarrassing them for her. He proposed a different arrangement. She would stay within 20 paces of him. In exchange, when they slew a monster together, he would claim only the tail or the tooth or the ear as his portion, and let the rest of the kill count go on her ledger. The generosity of the offer was so unbalanced that she suspected a trap for a full 10 seconds. Then a scream broke somewhere in the trees, closer than any of them wanted to admit. Chelsea agreed. They moved. Within an hour, Leo learned 2 things about her. The first was that she was, in fact, an excellent mage. Her formulas were clean, and she chose them with the calm of a girl who had been drilled by 3 different tutors before breakfast. The second was that she had never in her life fought anything that fought back. Her tutors had made her cast at wooden targets. The forest did not stand still to be hit. They found a rift bear inside a ravine. It was as large as a wagon, and it moved like a puddle of oil, gliding around trunks that should have blocked it. Chelsea's first ice spike missed by a full pace, and she froze in place, panicked, watching the shards sink harmlessly into a tree. The bear turned its head. It saw her. Leo stepped between them. He did not draw the sword on his back. He drew a knife instead, a small utility blade with no aura on it at all. He circled the bear on the left, drawing its eye, and when its jaw came at him, he sidestepped so tightly that its teeth clacked shut on empty air a hand's width from his cheek. He used the momentum. He came up along its jaw, drove the knife into the soft place under the base of its skull, twisted once, and stepped away as it collapsed onto its own knees and slid, without any grand noise, into the dirt. The whole encounter took less than a breath and a half. Chelsea was still holding her second spell, unformed, above her palm. He turned to her, blood on his sleeve, and asked her, politely, whether she preferred the tooth or the claw for her tally. She looked at him. She looked at the bear. She looked at him again. She began, at that moment, to change her mind about him. They moved deeper, the kills mounted, and Chelsea's aim steadied by the third one. Somewhere ahead, other candidates were fighting their own battles. Screams came in irregular bursts through the trees, and once a burst of fire lit up a whole slope in orange for 2 seconds before going out. Chelsea flinched at each one. Leo did not. At noon, by his own count, a horn blew across the forest, low and long. It was the exam's warning. A subjugation target had emerged. Every candidate had heard the rumor before entering. The wild forest kept, at its center, one great beast, whose head alone would guarantee a passing grade to whoever brought it home. In real hero worlds, that beast had once been slain by 3 heroes at the height of their powers. In this exam, the applicants were expected to survive its appearance, not to kill it. Killing it, obviously, was the fastest way to top the entire year's rankings. Chelsea's eyes went to Leo the instant the horn stopped. He was already looking in the direction the sound had come from. They ran. They were not the first to arrive. On a wide clearing at the center of a stand of pale birches, 2 other cadets had already engaged the thing that had climbed out of the earth. It was, by the exam's records, called a tarantula, though the name did the shape no favors. It was the size of a small house. Its legs were the thickness of a man's waist and ended in points that punched holes through birches like the trees were paper. Its underside pulsed with a sick, thick light. Every time a blade opened one of its wounds, the wound stitched itself back closed inside 2 seconds. The 2 cadets already fighting it looked as if they had been fighting it for a very long 2 minutes. Leo recognized both of them. One was Celia. She was a proper cadet again, out of her maid's apron and back inside armor, her family sword lit gold in her hand. Her braid had come loose and her cheek was streaked with dirt, but her stance was still the stance of a Zeringer prodigy under fire, precise and stubborn. Her aura flared in short, controlled bursts, because she had already realized, correctly, that spending it all at once on this thing would only leave her empty when the wound closed itself. The second was the Beastman boy from the courtyard. He was shorter than any of them, broad in the shoulders, and moved with a low, close-to-the-ground quickness that Leo remembered from very old memories. His hands ended in dark claws that were currently red to the second knuckle. He was working the tarantula's offside leg, tearing at it with a rhythm so patient that even Leo raised an eyebrow. He introduced himself, over his shoulder, in one 3-word breath. His name, he said, was Abad. He would appreciate any help. He kept slashing without waiting for a reply. Chelsea skidded to a stop at the tree line and asked, in a voice 1 note above panic, what exactly Leo intended to do without aura. Leo told her to hold the tree line and to freeze anything that came off the beast toward her. Then he stepped into the clearing. He did not raise the sword on his back. He would not yet. He drew the small knife again instead. The 2 bracelets on his wrists were still active under his sleeves. Beneath the invisible weight of them, his footwork was already a kind of dance no 15-year-old in this age was supposed to know. The tarantula noticed him inside its first breath. 4 legs moved at once. He was between all 4 of them, and past all 4 of them, before their tips reached the dirt. He came up under its jaw, tapped the underside of a fang with the flat of his knife to make it flinch, and slid out again the far side. The tarantula's own strike carried it a full body length forward, and drove 3 of its legs so deep into the loam that it wasted a full second pulling them out. Celia stared. She had never seen him move like that. She had, however, seen him move enough to trust it. She adjusted at once. She stopped pouring her aura into cuts and started pouring it into holds. When one of the tarantula's legs tried to spear at Abad, she stepped in and locked her blade against it, aura flaring bright against the black chitin, and held it in place for the 2 heartbeats Abad needed to twist away. Abad understood. He shifted. He stopped trying to open the same wound twice and started opening a new wound each pass, spreading the regeneration thin. Every time the tarantula's underside pulsed to close a cut, one of Abad's fresh cuts elsewhere delayed the closing by another half-second. The cumulative effect was small. Given enough time, though, it would matter. Leo told them, calmly, across the noise, that they needed 5 minutes. Neither of them asked why. Neither of them had breath to. He gave them 5 minutes. 5 minutes was, in that clearing, an insane amount of time. He danced through the tarantula's legs the way a man walks through his own living room in the dark. He never let it settle. He tapped one of its eyes with the pommel of his knife and made it flinch its whole body sideways. He slid under its belly and grazed the thick pulsing sac at its center with the knife's edge. Not enough to open it, only enough to make the sac tighten defensively. which cost the beast a full second of its regeneration cycle. He reappeared behind its back left leg and drove the knife's point into a joint no living thing was supposed to have and made the leg fold under it. He was, Chelsea realized with a slow horror, doing this without a drop of aura in his body. She stopped watching him after the second minute because watching him made her want to sit down. She turned her attention outward instead and began building a formula slowly, layer over layer, the way her tutors had taught her for spells too heavy to cast in a single breath. At 3 minutes, the tarantula understood, in whatever way monsters understood things, that the small human between its legs was the problem. It stopped chasing Celia and Abad. It concentrated its whole attention on Leo. At 3 minutes, Leo smiled for the first time all afternoon. He drew it deliberately toward the west side of the clearing. He let it think he was tiring. He staggered on one turn, just enough. The tarantula lunged, all 8 legs bunched, and drove its body forward with the entire weight of its lifting mass. At 4 minutes and 30 seconds, Chelsea released her spell. A field of ice bloomed under the tarantula's feet. It was not fine ice. It was rough, ridged, cheap-looking ice, the kind a first-year sorcerer could produce and hold. Under the beast's own charging weight, it was enough. The tarantula's front legs skidded. Its rear legs, still driving, kept coming. The whole shape of the beast pitched forward, and the pulsing sack at its center swung, exposed, for exactly the beat and a half that a boy under it would need. Leo did not draw his sword. Celia did. She had already broken away from her own defensive line and covered the ground toward the beast's front. When Leo turned his palm up, empty, she flipped her family blade end over end in the air. He caught it by the hilt without looking. He drove it upward into the sack and pushed it into the guard. The tarantula did not scream. It shuddered once, like an old barn taking a hard wind. Then it went slack, all 8 legs folding at the same time, and it came down on its side with a slow, boneless slump that shook every birch in the clearing. The 3 of them stood in silence. Somewhere out in the trees, another horn blew, this one long and steady, the exam signal that a target had been felled. Abad walked over, wiped a clawed hand on his own hide vest, and offered it. Leo took it. Celia retrieved her blade with a dignified tug and wiped it on the grass, and did not say a single word about who had asked whom to throw a sword to whom. Her ears, again, were a shade too pink for the weather. Chelsea stumbled out of the tree line and looked at all 3 of them the way a small child looks at a fireworks display. They had 5 minutes to breathe before the next thing came. The next thing did not come. Instead, high above the treetops, a shape resolved itself out of the sky. It was Professor Albie. He was standing on a disk of pale light, arms folded, looking down at the clearing as if he had been watching the fight from the first breath. His left eye was, from this distance, a very steady, very dark point. He congratulated them, briefly, on doing something the exam had not expected any candidate to do. He informed them that the wild forest would be closed early. He told the rest of the applicants, in a voice that reached every corner of the record at once, that they were to gather at the eastern glade to be extracted. Then, just for the length of a breath, his gaze fell on Leo alone. The look was not hostile. It was not friendly either. It was the look of a scholar who had just noticed a footnote in a book he had already read 100 times. The clearing began to blur, the birches thinning into pale streaks of light, and the forest was gone, and the courtyard came back. Leo landed on the stones of Lumina, one hand still faintly warm from a sword he had not lifted, and stayed standing on legs that, by any honest reckoning, ought to have been shaking. He was not looking at the courtyard. He was looking, sideways, at Professor Albie, who had reappeared on his dais, and had gone back to reading names off a list as if nothing had happened at all. The professor's left eye stayed steady. It did not pulse. It did not flare. It did what it always did, which was store away everything it had seen and give nothing back. Leo made 2 decisions in the space of 1 breath. The first was that whatever lived under that eye was old, older than anything a Lumina cadet was supposed to walk near, and that it had almost certainly recognized something in the way he had moved out there under the birches. The second was that Professor Albie Zeron had, at some point in the last few minutes, quietly moved from the list of people Leo intended to observe to the list of people who would, sooner or later, learn who he really was. He filed that away, straightened his sleeve over the bracelet on his wrist, and stepped forward when his name was called. Across the courtyard, in a knot of applicants nobody was watching, A slim boy with sunken eyes stared at Leo's back and did not blink for a very long time. His name, though nobody in the courtyard had asked for it yet, was Senlu. In his sleeve, curled tight against his forearm, a thin band of black cloth was slowly warming against his skin. Somewhere far away, in a small stone room with a candle that gave no honest light, a hooded handler set a book down and smiled at a page that had, on its own, begun to write. Results were posted the next morning on a wall of pale wood outside the tallest tower, and the crowd around them was so thick that a small skirmish broke out over who had elbowed whom. Leo did not go to the wall. He waited under a colonnade until the crowd thinned. When he finally walked up, 3 staff members were still standing by the board, and one of them stiffened when she saw him. His name was not at the top of the list. His name was above the list. The board had a small panel of its own, framed in silver, that sat over the ordinary rankings the way a title sits over a page. His name filled that panel alone. Underneath, in a smaller script, ran 2 words that had not been printed on that board in 20 years. Night Division. Beside the words, marked in the old Lumina script, was the designation of a representative. The staff member coughed and asked, with the politeness of someone who had been told to be very polite, whether the young master would please follow her to the vice principal's office at his earliest convenience. Behind him, someone in the crowd whispered the word representative, and the whisper spread through the courtyard the way a spark spreads through dry grass. He followed her. The vice principal was not in the room. The professor who was, instead, was the one Leo had noticed. Albie sat behind a plain desk with his hands folded. Beside him stood a woman in the deep green robes of the Zeringer branch of the family, and Leo recognized her at once. She was the eldest of his mother's living cousins. Her presence in this room, on this day, was not an accident. Albie did not waste time. He informed Leo that the entrance exam scoring, once fully tallied, had placed him first by a margin so wide that the tallying board had asked to run the numbers a second time. He informed him that Lumina's Night Division, which had been a hollow department for 20 years because no candidate had qualified for it, was to be reopened with a single representative. He informed him that the Zeringer branch of the family had petitioned the Academy to release one of their sealed secret techniques to the boy, on the grounds that a Night Division representative who could not hold his own against senior cadets would embarrass the entire school. The professor said all of this in the voice of a man reading a shopping list. He then asked, without changing his tone, whether Leo would care to explain how a cadet with no aura training had drawn the attention of a beast that no first year had subdued for 18 years. Leo answered him honestly, as far as he was willing to go. He said his mother had taught him footwork. He said his cousin had lent him her sword at the right moment. He said the Beastman applicant had done most of the actual damage. He did not say a single word about bracelets, and he did not glance, even for a fraction of a heartbeat, at the professor's left eye. Albie listened. He did not press. When Leo finished, the professor nodded once and turned him over to the Zeringer cousin. Her name was Ilsa. She led him down a corridor, lined with pale blue banners, to a small circular chamber at the base of the West Tower. On a plain table at its center lay a slim book, bound in red leather, with the Zeringer crest tooled into its cover. She placed her hand on the cover, and the crest lit briefly in gold under her palm. She told him, quietly, that this was the Phoenix Breath. She told him that the technique had been developed by a Zeringer ancestor who had studied an ancient fire hero's records for 11 years, and who had, at the end of those 11 years, isolated a single principle. She told him that only 3 living Zeringers had mastered the technique. She told him that if he failed to reach it within 1 year, the book would return to the vault and no one would speak of the loan again. She asked whether he accepted. Leo asked whether he could read the first page before answering. She hesitated, then opened it for him. The first page held a diagram. It showed a shape of aura burning inside a body, curled in the manner of a small living bird, and around the bird a shell of fine breath, and around the breath a single controlled channel that ran the length of a leg. Below the diagram was a short passage of text that described how the technique compressed a full second of aura output into a single burst. Leo read the page twice. He had seen a variant of this drawing before. He had drawn it, in fact, in the margin of a training scroll, 5,000 years ago, when a young Zeringer ancestor had asked him how he pushed off the ground so fast in a duel. The ancestor had been polite and quick, and had taken his own notes. Those notes apparently had survived long enough to become a family secret. He kept his face still. He accepted the loan. He bowed to Ilsa, exactly as courtesy required and no more, and closed the book. Ilsa asked, at the door, whether he understood what an honor had been done him. Leo said he understood. He did not say that the honor was, in a very quiet way, his own book coming back to him. The rest of that week passed in packing. His father wept at the gate in a dignified, private way, and his mother pressed a hand against his shoulder for one long moment and did not say anything at all. Whatever she wanted to say was, apparently, best left unsaid. He carried her sword. He carried the red book. He carried the 2 bracelets on his wrists. The academy did not send its incoming cadets to the towers by carriage. It sent them by ship. The Lumina ship was a broad, low-hulled vessel with pale blue sails, moored at the mouth of the great river that fed the city. Cadets boarded by house name and stood in tidy clusters on the upper deck. Leo boarded alone. Chelsea was already on board, and she found him within a minute, planted herself 2 paces behind his shoulder, and pretended not to be planting herself. Celia arrived with a Zeringer honor guard and pretended, with equal dedication, not to have looked for him first among the crowd. Abad, quieter than any of them, was already seated cross-legged on a coil of rope near the bow, chewing on a strip of jerky and watching the water. The captain of the ship was a Lumina professor whose name Leo did not yet know. He was tall and slight, and he was reading a book. He did not put the book down when the ship pulled away from the dock. He did not put it down when the ship reached open water. He did not put it down, in fact, when a cadet at the port rail shouted about something moving under the surface off their bow. He turned one page. Leo followed the cadet's finger. The sea below them had gone the wrong color. A wide, dark patch spread beneath the hull, and inside it something turned, slow and enormous. The dark patch was not a shadow. It was a body. A tentacle broke the water first. It was as thick as the ship's mast. It rose, dripping, and paused, and considered the deck the way a cat considers a table it intends to jump onto. Then a second tentacle rose. Then a third. The captain turned another page. Leo understood, with a clarity that was almost funny, that the professor was not going to lift a finger. The welcome, apparently, was the exam. The cadets on this deck were expected to defend their own transport. He did not wait for the panic to organize itself. He stepped forward, put 2 fingers in his mouth, and cut the deck's noise with a whistle that was not loud but was, somehow, absolute. Faces turned. He gave them, in 6 sentences, what they needed. Aura users to the rails, mages to a fixed line behind them, summoners to the mast. Nobody was to try to slay the beast alone. The goal was not the head. The goal was the eye above the surface, which he could already see rising, pale as a moon, 20 paces off the port side. He did not shout. He did not raise his voice at all. He spoke the way a man speaks in a room he has been the master of for years. Cadets who did not know him obeyed him anyway, which was, in itself, a thing that would be discussed later. Celia went to the port rail with her sword and set the first line. Chelsea took a position 3 paces behind her and began layering a slow spell. The same layered method she had used in the forest, this time with a wider footprint. Abad went up the mast without waiting to be asked, and from the crow's nest began throwing marker stones at the eye to make it flinch, so the mages under him would have easier targets. The kraken lifted higher. Leo drew his mother's sword for the first time in this life. He did not light it with aura. He held it in a low guard and moved along the port rail. A tentacle came in fast, thick as a house beam, and he stepped inside its arc, ran the blade along its underside in one clean slide, and stepped out again the far side. The tentacle did not fall off. It did, however, retreat. That was enough. The cadets watched the retreat and understood, at once, that the beast could be hurt. Morale, on ships as on battlefields, was a thing you turned. In the next 20 seconds, 3 separate spells cracked into the open eye at once. Chelsea's ice buried a wedge of pale rime into the pupil. A boy Leo did not know sent a wind lance in behind it that shattered the ice inward. A girl further down the rail followed the wind lance with a small, tight lightning bolt that pushed the shattered ice deeper still. The kraken screamed, which was a sound none of them wanted to hear again. It withdrew all at once, taking the sea back down with it, and the ship rocked once, hard and settled. The captain turned another page of his book. Leo cleaned his mother's blade on a rag from his sleeve and slid it back into its wrap. He did not look at the captain. He did not need to. He could feel, without turning his head, that the professor had lifted his eyes from the book for exactly 2 seconds during the whole encounter, and had spent both of those seconds looking at Leo. The ship docked at the base of the Lumina wharf as though nothing at all had happened. The cadets who staggered off onto the stone were not the same cadets who had boarded. Something in the way they held their shoulders had shifted. Chelsea, walking beside Leo, quietly took hold of the back of his sleeve for the length of the gangway, and did not, when they stepped onto the wharf, quite let go. The welcoming ceremony was held that same afternoon in the Great Hall. It was a formal thing. Rows of cadets in their new uniforms. A dais with 3 chairs. Banners along the walls, one for each of the Academy's oldest classes. The vice principal opened with a speech. He said many correct, dry things about honor and study. He then, as tradition required, introduced the incoming representative of each division and invited that representative to say a word to the assembled cadets. The Day Division representative said a bland, polite word. The Dawn Division representative said a slightly less bland, less polite word. Then the vice principal said Leo's name, and the hall went quiet the way a forest goes quiet before weather. Leo stepped up onto the dais. He did not smile. He did not need to. He put his hands loose at his sides. He looked out over the hall, and he said, in the same ordinary voice he had used on the ship, that he was pleased to be the first Night Division representative in 20 years. He said that he understood some cadets, especially the older ones, might find the appointment insulting. He said that he had, therefore, one standing invitation to offer. Any cadet in the school, at any year, in any division, who felt that the Night Division representative had been chosen wrongly, was welcome to challenge him personally for the title. The hall stopped breathing for a moment. Leo said, then, that he would accept any and all such challenges, on any field, without conditions, and that he would not bring the challenge or the outcome to the school council afterward, regardless of who won. He bowed once, evenly, and stepped down. The vice principal, on the dais behind him, looked mildly nauseous. The first challenge came before dinner. His name was Duran Moira, and he was, by every account Leo had heard so far, the second-ranked prodigy of the incoming year. He was a lightning aura user from a middle noble house that had spent 3 generations climbing. His hair stood up in short, dark spikes, and there was a permanent tightness in his jaw that suggested a life spent chewing on other people's rankings. He met Leo in the cadet corridor outside the dining hall, with 3 of his friends behind him, and he did not so much challenge Leo as inform him that a challenge had already been arranged. Lightning against nothing, Duran said, sneering slightly, since Leo had, apparently, no aura at all. Leo asked him what sort of contest he had in mind. Duran had, of course, already thought of one. He proposed a foot race, from the base of the West Training Field to the top of the East Observatory Hill, a distance of about half a mile. He proposed no weapons. He proposed no rules other than to reach the top first. He proposed a public audience, which meant the entire first year plus anyone else who cared to attend, which was going to mean most of the school. Leo said yes. Duran narrowed his eyes at the speed of the yes. He had expected, at least, a hesitation. He was not going to get one. He turned on his heel and left, and his 3 friends went with him, and Chelsea, watching from a doorway 6 paces behind Leo, muttered something under her breath that would have gotten her fined by a strict tutor. The race was scheduled for the next dawn, which meant, in Lumina's language, an hour before the sun cleared the observatory. By that hour, the fields on both ends were packed. Cadets sat on the grass. Cadets sat on walls. Cadets sat, illegally, on the roofs of 2 lecture halls. Professors sat on chairs that had been carried out by disapproving assistants who had, in the end, carried the chairs out. Somewhere in the crowd, Albi Zeron leaned against a low stone wall with his arms folded and did not appear to be paying attention. Leo arrived in a simple training tunic and trousers. Duran arrived in the full lightweight kit of the Moira house, with a thin steel band across his brow and small charms at his wrists that glowed faint blue with stored charge. Around Leo's own wrists, under his sleeves, the 2 bracelets sat in silence, dormant. He had not deactivated them. He was not going to deactivate them either. The starting line was scratched into the grass with a stick. A senior cadet counted them down. Duran vanished. He was, Leo had to admit, genuinely fast. He was fast in the way lightning aura users at the peak of their first year were supposed to be fast. He shot from the starting line in a single crackling white streak, cleared the first stretch of open field in 3 heartbeats, and was already halfway up the slope of the observatory hill, before the crowd finished exhaling. Behind him, along the marked path, thin scorch lines lingered in the grass where his heels had touched down. Leo did not run, he walked. He walked for 6 full paces, unhurried, while the crowd began to make noises that were not, strictly, cheers. Then he lifted his gaze to the observatory and, in the space of one breath, did something no cadet in the hall had ever seen a human being do. He crouched. He drove his weight down into the balls of his feet. He drew a single breath in through his nose, held it inside the shape of a small curled bird at the center of his chest, and then let that bird spread its wings once. The phoenix breath did not, according to the Zeringer scrolls, produce visible flame at its first stage. It produced only heat and a very fine, very controlled ripple of it around the caster's legs. The scrolls said that a full mastery of the technique would, at the end of a decade of training, allow a Zeringer to sprint half a mile in a single breath. The scrolls had been written by a family who had, 5,000 years ago, watched an ancient hero do exactly that in front of them, and who had spent 11 years trying to reverse engineer the shape of it. Leo did not need 11 years. He remembered the shape. He turned aside from the marked path. He ran, in one long, weightless bound, straight up the low retaining wall of the West training field. The wall was chest-high. He crossed it in a single step. The cadets sitting on it scattered in shrieks that were half fear and half delight. He landed on the packed dirt on the far side and used the landing to fire himself forward off the ball of his foot in a diagonal that took him not up the slope but across it. For an instant, high above the crowd, framed against the pale gray of a not yet risen sun, he was a red streak. His clothes had not caught fire, and neither had his skin. The heat of the phoenix breath had gathered around him in a thin, controlled aura, dyed by the compression of the technique into a color the crowd would talk about for weeks. He looked, briefly and honestly, like a small red meteor moving sideways over the school. He passed Duran 20 paces from the top of the hill. Duran, at full lightning sprint, saw him only as a red blur at the very corner of his eye. He turned his head, instinctively, and by the time his head finished turning, Leo was already ahead of him. Duran's next step was not, technically, wrong. It only fell exactly where a red streak was no longer standing. Leo touched down at the summit of the observatory hill, took 2 ordinary steps, and stopped. He turned back. He did not smile. He waited, calmly, for Duran to arrive, which Duran did 4 heartbeats later, at a stumble, with the last of his stored charge sputtering off his charms in useless little sparks. He greeted Duran with the same calm voice he had used in the corridor. He told him, gently, that he did not think lightning was slow. He told him, gently, that lightning had simply been aimed at the wrong hill. He offered a hand. Duran did not take it, but he did not, when he straightened, sneer. He looked at Leo for a long, breath-held moment, and then he bowed. It was a short bow, and stiff, and probably the first honest one he had given anyone that year. He said the challenge was settled. He said, more quietly, that he intended to challenge again, at the end of the year, when he had grown. He said it as a promise, not a threat. Leo returned the bow at the same depth. Behind Duran, the crowd finally began to make the sound it had been holding in. It rolled up the hill in a wave that broke over both of them and did not politely stop. Down at the low stone wall, Albi Zeron finally lowered his arms. He walked, unhurried, back toward the tower. Halfway there, he paused and looked, just once, over his shoulder at the top of the hill, where a boy in a plain training tunic was helping a lightning prodigy pick a burr out of his sleeve. The professor's left eye did not pulse. It did not need to. He continued on his way, and if anyone had been paying close enough attention, they would have seen him take a small, folded piece of paper out of his sleeve, unfold it, glance at the single line of writing on it, and slip it back inside without breaking stride. The paper had one word on it, in the old Lumina script. Kyle. That evening, in the small stone room where a candle burned that gave no honest light, a hooded handler pressed her palm flat against a book bound in dead skin and asked, softly, whether the beastly little cadet she had been shaping for a year was ready. The book was still for a moment. Then a single line of script scrawled itself across the empty page in a handwriting the handler was not writing. He is ready. Send him in during the practical. The handler closed the book with a small, satisfied smile and reached, in the dark, for a bell that would summon a boy named Senlu, The summoning class met on an island the Academy did not, on any official map, admit to owning. It sat 2 hours upriver by a low, shallow-drafted boat, and the mist above it never fully lifted, not at noon, not in high summer. On its far shore, older cadets said, lived things that had names in the old tongue and no names at all in the new one. First-year visits stayed to the near shore, which was, allegedly, safer. Leo stepped off the boat behind Chelsea and thought, quietly, that whoever had drawn that line between the shores had been optimistic. The near shore had a small stone circle at its center, worn smooth by generations of cadet knees. The professor for the day was not the summoning department's regular head. He was a substitute, a thin, distracted man who introduced himself only by his surname and then, immediately, informed the students that they were not there to learn from him. They were there, he said, to be looked at. Looked at, he added, by whom, would be revealed shortly. Then he sat down on a stone bench and produced, from a satchel, a notebook and a small green apple. Behind him, the mist above the far side of the island darkened. The thing that arrived did not walk. It descended. It came down through the mist in a slow, easy spiral, and when it landed on the far side of the stone circle, the whole island seemed to warm by 2 degrees. It was larger than a horse and smaller than a house. Its feathers were the color of a sunset that had not yet finished happening, and its eyes were the color of a much older, much steadier fire. The temperature at Leo's cheek rose without any breeze to carry it. The Phoenix Fina looked at the cadets. The cadets, to their credit, mostly stayed standing. The substitute professor did not look up from his apple. Fina walked, one slow step at a time, around the inside of the stone circle. She did not speak. She stopped in front of a Syrian exchange cadet at the far end of the line, considered him with the polite disinterest of a queen considering a candlestick, and moved on. She stopped in front of a boy with a lion familiar half-formed on his shoulder, snorted a small breath of heat that made the lion evaporate back into its owner's mana, and moved on. She stopped in front of Chelsea, tilted her head slightly, and moved on. She stopped in front of Leo. She stayed there. She did not tilt her head. She looked at him with both eyes at once, which, in a bird of that size, was a thing that felt more like being weighed than being seen. The heat around her rose. Leo did not step back. He also did not, quite, meet her stare. He kept his eyes on the small hollow of feathers at the base of her throat, the way a good horseman keeps his eyes on the point between an unfriendly stallion's ears, and he waited. She spoke without moving her beak. Her voice was not a voice. It was a warmth pressed directly against his mind, and it carried the shape of words. She asked him whether he remembered her. Leo held very still. He answered, in the same warm, silent shape, that he remembered her sister. He apologized for outliving her. The Phoenix Fina considered this for a long moment. The heat around her did not rise further. It did not, either, fall. She informed him, again without moving her beak, that her sister had told her, on the last day of the old age, that a certain small human would one day come back and be inconvenient about it. She informed him that her sister had been correct. She then, very deliberately, spread her wings. The substitute professor, at the bench, closed his apple in his hand and finally looked up. Fina told the cadets, out loud this time, in a voice that made the near stones ring, that she required a volunteer. Every cadet in the circle went completely still, in the way of small animals when something with wings has just spoken directly to them. Chelsea's hand went up. Leo pushed her hand back down. He stepped forward. He stopped at the center of the circle, and he asked, aloud, what she required. Fina told him. It was a short instruction. She told him that in her nest, on a small warm stone, sat an egg that had not, in 3 years, been willing to hatch. She told him that a phoenix's flame was, in its natural state, unbearable to any mortal body, and that no summoner in 3 years had been willing to stand inside it long enough for the egg to feel the warmth it needed. She told him that if any of the cadets in that circle wished to attempt the hatching, she would carry them, and she would set them among her fire, and she would keep them alive for as long as their soul held together. She did not, she added, guarantee how long that would be. The other cadets did not move. Leo stepped past her, walked to the far side of the circle, and knelt down in front of a shape none of them had noticed before. There was, in a hollow of warm stones just beyond the circle, a single dull red egg, smaller than a loaf of bread, and it looked, to any ordinary eye, entirely dead. He put both his palms flat on the stones on either side of it. He said quietly, that he was ready. The Phoenix Fina lifted her wings. The fire that came off her was not fire. It was the memory of fire, the essential shape of it, the way an ocean holds inside itself the memory of every drop that made it. It rolled over Leo in a slow, gentle wave, and the wave took the skin off the back of his hands in the same breath. He did not move. He kept his palms on the stones. He kept his eyes on the egg. He held, at the center of his chest, the small curled shape of the phoenix breath, and he let it act, in that moment, not as a source of speed, but as a translator. The technique had been built from a phoenix's rhythm. It knew, in some quiet way, how to answer one. Around him, the killing fire came in a second wave, and the second wave took the skin off his forearms, and Leo did not move. He spoke to the egg. He did not speak with words. He spoke with the memory of an old friend's warmth, 5,000 years old, kept in a small, still corner of him that had never been asked to open until now. The egg answered. At first it only warmed. Then a fine, hairline crack traced itself along one side. Then, without any dramatic sound at all, the shell parted, and a small, damp, indignant creature stepped out into the world for the first time. She was the size of a cupped palm. Her feathers were wet, and, wet, they were the color of a very ordinary sparrow. She looked at Leo. She looked at the burned skin of his forearms. She looked at Leo again, then she opened her small beak and made, at him, a sound that was somewhere between a chirp and a demand. Fina folded her wings. The killing fire cut off as though it had been shut behind a door. Leo took his hands off the stones. He did not, quite, look at the damage. He held out one palm, blackened and shining, and the small damp chick stepped up into it, more heavily than her size should have allowed, and settled there. Behind him, the substitute professor's apple hit the ground. The Phoenix Fina, in that same warm, silent voice, gave the chick a name. She named her Fiora. She told Leo, in front of every cadet in that circle, that the pact was witnessed and would not be undone. She told him, further, that his forearms would heal, in time, and that they would carry, along the underside, a very fine gold seam that no ordinary healer would understand. She told him, in a lower voice that only he heard, that her sister had been right about him, and that she was, herself, glad he had come back. Then she lifted, one heavy wing beat at a time, back up into the mist. The substitute professor picked up his apple, brushed the dirt off it with unhurried care, and, without lifting his eyes to Leo, made a very small note in his notebook. Chelsea got to Leo before anyone else did. She did not, this time, take hold of his sleeve. She was smart enough to see that his sleeve would not appreciate being touched. She stood one pace off his shoulder, her face very pale, and asked, in a voice so quiet only he heard it, whether he was insane. Leo told her gently that he had been insane, once, 5,000 years ago, and that he had gotten better since. He held out his hand, chick and all, so she could see Fiora blinking up at her with the eyes of an entire ancient civilization's sunsets. Chelsea's face did a thing that she would not later admit to. She took, then, hold of Leo's sleeve, this time in the place above the elbow where the burn had not reached, and she walked him to the healers herself. The magic theory exam was held 4 days later, in a wide, sunlit hall on the second floor of the West Tower, and the professor who administered it was not a substitute. His name was Len Horses, and he was, by universal agreement across the school, an eccentric. He wore his hair too long, he wore his robe too short. He forgot the names of his own students at least 3 times per lecture, and he was, at the same time, the sharpest theoretical mind in Lumina by a margin nobody bothered to measure. He set the exam himself. He wrote it out by hand on the morning of the test, every year, and every year the exam had, on it, exactly 50 questions. Every year, the 50th question was worth 51 points. Every year, in living memory, no cadet had answered it. The questions 1 through 49 were the ordinary ones. They asked about modern rune structures, about the classification of contemporary spells, about the standard conversion tables between mana types. They asked about names. They asked about dates. They asked about the memorized lineage of the modern sorcerers' guilds. They rewarded a diligent, well-tutored student who had spent a year with a proper textbook. The 50th question did not ask any of those things. The 50th question was written, always, in a slightly different hand at the bottom of the sheet, as if Professor Len had, just before turning the paper in, remembered something. The question, this year, was very short. It read, in plain script, that a candidate should describe the fundamental essence from which mana was derived, and, in describing it, should explain in what respect all three of the major derivations, aura, spell, and pact, shared a single ancestry, and how, in principle, one might act on that ancestry directly. The other cadets read the question. Some laughed, some sighed. Most did what cadets always did with the 50th question, which was to leave it blank, hand in the sheet, and walk out. Leo read the question twice. He did not answer questions 1 through 49. He turned the sheet over. On the back, in an unhurried, careful hand, he wrote out a description of the essence of mana as he had learned it 5,000 years ago, from a woman whose name had been carved into every tower of every human city, and who was, now, remembered as one of Leo's own comrades under a slightly different name. He described it as a single, still current that had been flowing under the world since before the world had known it was there. He described the three derivations not as three different substances, but as three different ways of listening to that current. Aura, he wrote, was the current running through a body's own instrument, remade as sound. Spell was the current, drawn out into the air, and shaped by rune the way a stringed instrument shaped a plucked note. Pact was the current shared, willingly, between two instruments at once, so that both listened to each other, and to the same underlying song. He described, then, in a paragraph that made him briefly homesick, how one might act on the ancestry directly. He described a state he called listening. In that state, he wrote, a caster did not draw on any of the three derivations. He simply became still enough that the current, which had been under everything all along, could pass through him without needing to be shaped. He signed the paper with his cadet number, folded it in half, walked to the front of the room, and laid it on Professor Len's desk. He walked out. He did not look, in passing, at any of the other cadets' sheets. Behind him, in the sunlit hall, Professor Len picked the sheet up. He unfolded it. He read the front. The front was blank. He turned the sheet over. He read the back once. He read the back a second time. He set the sheet down. He stood up from his chair. He walked, very calmly, out of the exam hall, down the corridor, up 2 flights of stairs, and into the vice principal's office without knocking. He shut the door behind him. Somewhere on the far side of the door, over the next quarter of an hour, several senior cadets at the end of the corridor heard, faintly, a sequence of noises they would later describe as a professor laughing, and then a professor arguing, and then, unmistakably, a professor threatening to resign if he was not immediately given the transfer paperwork for a cadet named Leo Plav to the full-time sorcery track. The vice principal, whose voice was not audible through the door but whose sigh was, denied the transfer. Professor Len emerged into the corridor with the sheet still in his hand, and, spotting a passing senior cadet, informed him that in the professor's professional opinion, the Night Division representative was the finest theoretical mind he had encountered in 20 years of teaching, and that this fact was to be considered common knowledge from that afternoon on. The senior cadet, wisely, wrote nothing down and simply passed the message along. By dinner, most of the school had heard. That evening, at the far end of the summoning island, on a small, warm rock too far from the near shore for any first year to have reached without permission, a boy stood alone with the sleeve of his uniform rolled up. On his forearm, a thin band of black cloth had grown into the skin. His name was Senlu. He had failed, 3 times in the last month, to summon anything larger than a mouse. He had failed, the 5th day running, to be looked at by any professor for longer than half a breath. In the entrance exam, the crowd had noticed a boy with no aura at all more than they had noticed him. He had, 3 nights ago, opened the small parcel that had been slipped under his door. Inside the parcel had been a black cord, and, wrapped inside the cord, a small dried claw of something no living cadet had ever hunted, and, wrapped inside the claw, a folded slip of paper on which one line had been written. The line had read that any summoner who wore this cord in the presence of an untethered Tartaros beast would be judged worthy. Senlu had put the cord on that same night. He had not taken it off since. He was, at this hour, standing on the warm rock and speaking, softly, to a shape in the mist that had not yet fully arrived, and the shape was answering him, and the answer was making him smile in a way his own mother, had she been there, would not have recognized. Miles away, in the Tower of Lumina, Professor Albi Zeron stood at his office window with his hands folded behind his back, watching a candle in a distant tower burn a color that no ordinary candle burned. His left eye did not pulse. It only recorded, patiently, what it saw. Behind him, on his desk, a folded slip of paper with a single word on it lay open. The word was still Kyle. Beside it, now, in the same hand, a second word had been added. The second word was watching,